The salty spray that hits your face as you are dragged towards the great ship pulled up to the shore. That was the last familiar sensation you felt. Close your eyes and for a moment visualize what that girl experienced. On the shores of Ireland, just 17 years old. And her life was ruined right at that moment. They are shouting loudly, laughing and mocking, claiming ownership of her body. The thick, rusty chains around your wrists. Around you, the rising smoke of your burning home stings your eyes, polluting the air. A funeral pyre for the single life you once had. You are no longer a person. You are property, commodity, and the most terrifying journey of your life has just begun. This was the Viking Age, which lasted from the late 8th to the mid-11th century. This is usually how we were taught, wasn't it? With adventures, legendary warriors, those incredibly great ships. Tales and stories come and go in our minds. But behind those sagas of heroism and those gripping adventures lies a far more terrifying and far uglier truth. For hundreds of years, the daring economy of the North was powered by a massive, organized, and terrifyingly brutal trade in human beings. Look, this was not a random byproduct of raids. This was, more often than not, the primary goal. It was the most profitable, most easily transportable form of plunder. What we are going to tell you today will demonstrate that the Viking Age was, for countless women from the British Isles to the Slavic East, an enterprise of kidnapping, commodification, and lifelong exploitation. This is not conjecture. This is not an attempt to exaggerate the past. This is a reality meticulously reconstructed from the Vikings' own legal codes, from the monastic chronicles written by their victims, from archaeological evidence unearthed from the ground, and even from the cold, impartial eyewitness accounts of the Arab diplomats who traded with them. If you find value in exploring the unvarnished truths of our past, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and dive into the depths of this dark history with us. Moneybag Part 1. Not a raid, but a business model. First, let's look at the system because they did it systematically. In the movies you watch, Viking raids are usually shown as a sudden burst of violence. No, historical sources suggest they resembled a predatory commercial enterprise more than a simple plundering. Raiding parties were an investment. A local chieftain or a group of felagar, meaning business partners, would pool money to build ships. Timber, iron, sailcloth, provisions. These were all serious capital. And these investors, of course, expected a return. What was the most valuable, most portable, and most consistent return on this investment? Human cargo. The ships themselves were engineering marvels. The shallow draft of vessels like the Snecka or Skade meant they could not only cross the open seas, they could also advance far up rivers, deep into inland territories. They could bypass coastal defenses and strike deep into unsuspecting lands. A community living hundreds of miles from the coast might wake up to Viking ships on the riverside, their escape routes now cut off. This technological superiority provided the critical component of the slave hunt, the element of surprise. So who did they target? What historians call soft targets. Places like the famous raid on the Iona Monastery in 806, where 68 monks were massacred, were valuable not only for their silver and valuable vestments, but also for the literate monks and the local people who had sought refuge there. Shocking records. The entries in the Irish annals are terrifying in their simplicity. A record from 8821 notes that the Vikings carried off a great crowd of women into captivity. This phrase, great crowd, appears repeatedly. This was not an anomaly. This was the core Viking business model. Part 2. Commodification and the erasure of identity. After capture, a woman's name and past were systematically erased. She was no longer a daughter, a wife, a sister. She was now a thrall. This Old Norse word for slave was the name of a terrifying status. The Old Norse language itself reveals their dehumanization of these individuals. In legal texts, slaves were often categorized with inanimate objects. They placed them in the same class as livestock. They were fey, a word that meant both cattle and wealth. According to Norse law, a thrall belonged to the class of dehumanized animals. She was an object, a piece of property. Lawlessness. They had no legal rights. A master could beat or even kill his slave without any cause. According to the Icelandic law code Gragas, a slave's testimony was inadmissible in court. They could not own property. They could not enter into a legal marriage. The worst part, their children were born into slavery just like them, and the system thus continued. While the life of a free woman was protected by law, there was nothing to protect the life of a thrall. The departure from home was the first step into hell. Captives would be bound and marched barefoot for miles to the ships waiting on the shore. There, they were crammed into open vessels alongside the greedy warriors for sea voyages that could last for weeks. Imagine dozens of people in an area of 70 to 80 feet, exposed to the freezing waters and harsh weather of the North Atlantic. Their food was very little water and hardtack. Disease was rampant. We cannot even imagine the psychology of those people in that situation. Most could not withstand the rigors of the journey. Part 3. The Slave Highway from Dublin to the Abbasid Caliphate. For those who survived, the destination was a place where slaves were like the walking dead. The Vikings had established a colossal network across their sphere of influence. Dublin, was a massive slave market with the most notorious reputation in all of Western Europe. Slaves brought from Ireland and Britain were traded here. From here, women could be sold to Scandinavian settlers in Ireland, sent back to Scandinavia, or shipped to newly colonized Iceland. But the network stretched further. East-facing ports like Hedeby, on the border of modern-day Germany and Denmark, and Birka, in Sweden, connected the Scandinavian world with the great rivers of Russia and Ukraine. This was the famous Volga trade route, a slavery superhighway that took captives from the west and especially from the Slavic lands in the east, referred to as Sakhalaba, and funneled them to the Byzantine Empire and the incredibly wealthy Abbasid Caliphate. The sheer scale of this trade was unimaginable. A captive taken from an English village could be shipped to Dublin, sold to another Norse merchant, transported to Birka, sold again, and then forced on a grueling journey down the Dnieper or Volga rivers to be sold one last time in the markets of Constantinople or Baghdad for Arab silver and silk. Silent evidence. This is not speculation. The physical evidence is clear. In Scandinavia, particularly on Gotland, which was a center of trade, tens of thousands of ancient coins have been unearthed. These silver hoards are the silent, metallic proof of the colossal trade between the Norse world and the Caliphate, a trade whose primary export from the north was human beings. In these markets, women's dignity was trampled upon. The 10th century Arab diplomat Ahmad ibn Fadlan, encountering Rus merchants on the Volga, provides a chilling eyewitness account. He recounts them lining up their captives for sale and writes that a merchant had sexual intercourse with a slave girl in front of his friend. Ibn Fadlan noted that this was done openly, a public display of absolute ownership. This was evidence of the woman's dehumanization. Their bodies were a market product for sale. Part 4. Fragile Bodies and Genetic Legacy. Once sold, a woman's fate was shaped by the demands of her new owner. The most common was a life of brutal, backbreaking labor. As a thrall, she was subjected to the heaviest chores in the household. She was the first to wake in the mornings and the last to go to bed at night. Her days consisted of grinding grain into flour with a heavy millstone, which wore down her teeth and strained her back, hauling water from the well, cooking, and washing clothes by hand in icy rivers. Another of her duties was textile production. A coarse woolen fabric called vadmal was a cornerstone of the Norse economy. This cloth was used for everything from sails to clothing and even as a type of currency. This entire industry rested on the backs of female slaves. The story in the bones. Archaeological evidence confirms this harsh life. Analysis of skeletal remains in Norse cemeteries shows that the slaves, buried with fewer grave goods, had significantly poorer diets than those of higher status. Their bones exhibit signs of malnutrition and extreme physical stress. They are the silent victims of a hard life. However, for many captured women, exploitation went beyond labor. They were also objects of sexual slavery. The body of a thrall, having no legal personality, was the property of her master, ready for him to use for any purpose. They did not see this as a crime. It was a right of ownership. Concubines, thriller warrior men, often took the women they captured as concubines. These were not clandestine affairs but recognized, informal domestic arrangements. Children born from these unions were known as frillorn, concubine children, and their legal status was inferior to that of legitimate heirs. A father could grant his child freedom, but he was not obliged to. He could condemn his own son or daughter to slavery. Here comes the most terrifying genetic evidence. This system of sexual exploitation has left a permanent mark on the genetic map of the North Atlantic. Modern genetic studies conducted in Iceland have revealed a fact. The male line, Y chromosome DNA, is approximately 80% of Norse origin, while the female line, mitochondrial DNA, is over 62% of Goidelic, Irish, and Scottish origin. The numbers speak. The foundation of Iceland was established largely by Norse men bringing Goidelic women with them. Given the Vikings' brutal raids on the British Isles, it is impossible to conclude that the majority of these women came there as willing spouses. They were the founding mothers of a new nation, but they were brought there in chains. The DNA that Icelanders carry today is the silent, irrefutable scientific evidence of a massive, gender-focused migration built upon kidnapping and sexual slavery. Part 5. The final property. Sacrifice. A tiny minority of captured women were kept for ransom or exchange. If a woman was highborn, a king's daughter or wife, she was seen as a political pawn rather than labor. However, there was one final, most horrifying fate that could befall a captured woman: human sacrifice. Archaeological and textual sources confirm the existence of this practice, and sometimes the chosen victims were female slaves. The most vivid, detailed, and disturbing account of this comes again from the Arab diplomat Ahmad ibn Fadlan. In AD 922, he witnessed the ship funeral ceremony of a great Rus chieftain on the Volga River. As part of the rites, a female slave was required to die with her master to serve him in the afterlife. Ibn Fadlan recounts that the girl was brought to the ship on the 10th day. She was laid next to her dead master by a ritual executioner known as the Angel of Death, strangled, and while the old woman repeatedly stabbed her between the ribs, other men loudly beat their shields to drown out the screams. This was a gruesome detail, a chilling measure taken to prevent other slave girls from being frightened and attempting to flee when their masters died. The Oseberg Mystery. Archaeological finds support this practice. In the famous Oseberg ship burial, 2 women were interred. One was an elderly, high-status noblewoman. The other was a younger woman whose skeletal analysis suggested a harder life and lower status. Many scientists believe the younger woman was a thrall sacrificed to accompany her mistress. The evidence is clear. For a captive woman, life might not end with slavery. She could become a grave offering for a powerful owner's journey to the afterlife, his final, bloody property. Part 6. Legacy and Epilogue. The cultural normalization of this brutality is perhaps the most chilling aspect of all. In Norse society, slave ownership was a fundamental marker of status and wealth. A powerful man's position was measured not just by land and silver, but by the number of unfree people he commanded. The sagas depict slavery not as a moral problem but merely as a simple, unquestioned fact of life. Exploitation was a cornerstone of their social and economic order. There were paths to freedom, yes, but they were narrow and rare. The process of freeing a slave was called manumission, but these stories were recorded precisely because they were exceptions. For the overwhelming majority of captured women, slavery was a life sentence, and that sentence was a legacy passed on to their children. What the Viking Age reveals is an uncomfortable truth about how systems of exploitation operate. The kidnapping and enslavement of women were not random acts of violence. It was an economic engine. It was a culturally sanctioned institution that underpinned the Viking world's expansion, colonization, and prosperity. When we look at the Viking Age, we must look beyond the official narrative. We must see the master shipbuilders, but we must also see the women who were forced to produce the sails for their ships. We must appreciate the sagas as great works of literature, but we must also read between the lines to see the casual brutality they normalized. The story of what the Vikings did to captured women is more than just a dark chapter of history. It is a fundamental case study in dehumanization, showing how easily a society can begin to view other human beings as commodities, tools, things to be used, traded, and discarded. The romantic image of the free and untamed Viking warrior is a fiction built upon the backs of the unfree and the brutally tamed. The true legacy of this era is written not just in runes, but in the silent, terrifying, and largely forgotten stories of the countless women whose lives were stolen to build their prosperity. I know how heavy what I have told you is, but the facts are not always like the tales. These women experienced this no matter how painful it is. What do you think about what I have told you? Share your thoughts with me in the comments. Also, which dark aspect of the Viking Age would you like me to examine in more detail? Write it in the comments. Have a good day.